The Philosophy of Plotinus, the Gifford Lectures at St. Andrews, 1917 to 1918, by William Ralph Inge, Dean of St. Paul's. Lectures 12 and 13, Immortality of the Soul. The Greeks, like the Jews, soon outgrew the barbarous notions about survival which are almost universal among savages. Both peoples, and especially the Jews, for a long period attached very little importance to the life after death, and when they came at last to make the belief in immortality a part of their religion, this belief was not even historically continuous with the ideas of primitive soul cultus, which had their center in the performance of pious duties to the departed spirit. This belief in a shadowy survival could lead to no doctrine of real immortality. The ruling idea in all Greek thought about life and death was that deathlessness is a prerogative of the gods. The gods, and the gods alone, are the immortals. In the national Greek religion, before it was influenced by the beliefs of other nations, there was no tendency to break down the barrier between the human nature and the divine. Greek ethics were largely based on the maxim that man must know his place. There had no doubt been instances, so it was believed, when the souls of heroes had been admitted into the company of the gods and allowed to share their immortality, but these were exceptional and miraculous favors which in no way affected the doom of ordinary men. The popular belief was that after death, we have nothing to look forward to except the unsubstantial and unenviable condition of ghosts, phantoms of mortal men outworn. The philosophical and religious belief in immortality came to the Greeks not from the Olympian religion, but from the mystical religion associated with the worship of Dionysus. It was perhaps the fundamental sanity and self-restraint of the Greek genius which led them to view with superstitious awe and amazement the manifestations of religious excitement with which they came in contact among other peoples. Even more than other nations, they were disposed to attribute the wild ebullitions of Oriental and semi-barbarous tribes to a divine madness, theomania, or possession by a god, enthusiasmos. It was especially Dionysus, the Thracian god, who makes men mad. He was probably the god of religious ecstasy, of dancing dervishes before he became the god of wine, which produces similar effects. For our present purpose, the important thing to note is that religious excitement produced an inner conviction or experience of the divine origin and destiny of the human soul. The author of The Contemplative Life, in a remarkable sentence, says that the bacchanals and corybantes continue their raptures until they see what they desire. That ecstasy is a form of madness was fully admitted. Galen defines it as brief madness, as madness is chronic ecstasy. But this did not prevent the belief that a man who was temporarily out of his mind might be the organ of some higher intelligence, and that in particular the gift of prophecy is thus imparted. Thus ecstasy helped to break down the barrier between men and gods, and orgiastic worship gave an empirical support to the philosophic mysticism which taught that there is no impassable cleft between the human and the divine spirit. The weakening of the idea of personality, which followed from its apparent diremption in ecstasy, promoted the belief in reincarnation and the transmigration of souls, which Euripides connects with Thrace and Dionysus. On the whole, we may say that the chief attraction of this worship was that it led up to flashes of intuition that man is immortal, like the gods. Sentimus et experimur nos aeternos esse, as Spinoza says. The Greeks attributed the warlike courage of the Thracians to the teaching of their religion, that death is a transition to a happier state. It cannot be said that this mystical faith in human immortality has left many traces on Greek literature. Pindar, whose poetry as a whole does not suggest deep spirituality, professes to believe in it, and Euripides has a more genuine sympathy with Orphic ideas. The Greek mind remained, throughout its great flowering time, positivist and humanistic. Even in Plato's Republic, Glaucon, who is an ordinary young Athenian, answers the question, "Have you not heard that our soul is immortal?" "No, really I have not." Of the philosophers, Thales is vaguely reported to have taught that souls are immortal. But neither he nor his immediate successors can be supposed to have believed in the immortality of particular souls as such. This doctrine belongs to the Orphic tradition. In Heraclitus and Parmenides we find the two doctrines of immortality which are implicit in mysticism, separated out for the first time. Heraclitus is the champion of the Dionysiac view that life and death follow each other in an unending cycle. Parmenides, under Orphic influence, teaches that the soul has fallen from the realm of light and reality to the dark and unreal world of bodily existence. This, however, is for Parmenides only the way of opinion. He feels, it would seem, that the substantiality of the world of common experience is not so easily got rid of. But he will not give up the unchanging stability of eternal substance. The most interesting fragment of Parmenides is that in which he seems to enunciate, for the first time in Greek thought, the mystical doctrine of eternity as a timeless now, as opposed to the popular notion of unending succession. There remains then only to give an account of one way, that real being exists. Many signs there are upon it showing that it is unborn, indestructible, entire, unique, unshakable, and unending. It never was, and it never will be, since it is altogether present in the now, one and indivisible. Empedocles vehemently repudiates the philosophy of Parmenides, probably on the ground that he reduces the world of time and change to nullity, and thus leaves no pathway from appearance to reality. His doctrine of the soul's exile and wanderings is expounded in a famous fragment. There is a decree of necessity, an old ordinance of the gods, everlasting, sealed with broad oaths, that whenever one of the daimons, whose portion is length of days, has sinfully stained his hands with murder or followed strife and committed perjury, he must wander away from the blessed gods for 30,000 seasons, being born throughout that time in all manner of mortal forms, passing from one to another of the painful paths of life. For the power of the upper air drives him toward the sea, and the sea spews him out upon dry land. Earth throws him into the rays of the burning sun, and the sun into the eddies of the air. One receives him from another, and all loathe him. Of these I myself am now one, an exile from God and a wanderer, because I put my trust in raging strife. This is the pure Orphic doctrine, which Pindar also gives us in the second Olympian Ode. The soul sins by separating itself from God, and after many adventures finds its way home again to him. The fall from God is a fall from love, and a choice of strife in the place of harmony. The immortal soul is said to consist of love and strife blended. The body with its senses is only an alien garment, and perishes at death. When Empedocles describes the soul as a ratio, or harmony, he means that the complex of discordant factors, strife, which it contains, is bound together by the principle of unity, love. As regards Parmenides, it may be true that he rejects the Pythagorean doctrines which he describes and finds truth in static materialism. Mr. Cornford says very well that Orpheus, the ideal of the Orphic brotherhood, is a Dionysus tamed and clothed and in his right mind. In the Orphic legend, it was the Maenads who tore Orpheus, the friend of the Muses, to pieces. The Greek spirit could not be content with orgiastic mysticism. The affinity between human and divine must be realized in a calmer temper, and must be made the basis not only of a cult, but of a philosophy. But the Pythagorean philosophy, like most philosophies, which are also religions, attempted to combine logically incompatible ideas. Pythagoreanism is an intellectualized Orphism, in which such questions as the following press for an answer. Is the descent of the soul part of a cosmic pulsation, a circulation of the lifeblood of the spiritual world, as Heraclitus taught? Or is it a thing which ought not to have occurred, and which must be remedied by the discipline which leads to deliverance? Is the soul a part of nature, or is it radically alien from nature, so that we must live our lives here as prisoners in a hostile country, or at best as pilgrims escaping from the city of destruction to the far-off city of God? Is the individual soul a mere mode of a universal life, or is it an eternal and indestructible substance? And is the universal soul a group soul, of which individual souls are integral parts, or is it a transcendent substance from which individual souls are derived, but from which they remain essentially distinct? How Pythagoras himself was thought to have combined some of the earlier answers to these questions is best shown by the summary of his doctrines preserved by Dicaearchus. He taught, first, that soul is immortal, then, that it is transferred into other kinds of living beings, further, that whatever comes into existence is born again in the revolutions of a certain cycle, and that nothing is absolutely new, and that all living things should be treated as akin to each other. But the emphasis is laid on the fortunes of the individual soul and its purification or deliverance by suffering, both here and hereafter. The Pythagoreans are in Europe the inventors of purgatory. Pythagoreanism was a mystical philosophy of immortality by death unto sin, and new birth unto righteousness. An important question is whether the Pythagoreans conceived of heaven as a timeless state, as we have seen that Parmenides did. Baron von Hugel has rightly insisted that all states of trance, or indeed of rapt attention, notoriously appear to the experiencing soul in proportion to their concentration as timeless, i.e. as non-successive, simultaneous, hence as eternal. And hence the eternity of the soul is not here a conclusion drawn from the apparent godlikeness in other respects of the soul when in this condition, but the eternity, on the contrary, is the very center of the experience itself, and is the chief inducement to the soul for holding itself to be divine. The soul's immortality cannot be experienced in advance of death, whilst its eternity, in the sense indicated, is or seems to be experienced in such this life states. Hence, the belief in immortality is here derivative, that in eternity is primary. But though the Orphic Pythagorean aspiration to escape from the weary wheel of rebirth seems to resemble the Buddhist longing for the timelessness of nirvana, it is certain that the Pythagoreans did not envisage the future life as unconscious. In the Orphic tablets, the soul, when it arrives in the other world, is forbidden to approach a certain spring, which must be the water of Lethe, and is bidden to draw near another by the lake of memory. The beatified soul, then, remembers its past. Here the influence of popular religion may be traced. The question as to the timelessness of the Pythagorean heaven does not admit of an answer, any more than the same question about the Christian heaven. All religious eschatology is a mass of contradictions. Although Plato has always and justly been regarded as the great champion of human immortality, it is impossible to find any fixed and definite conviction on the subject in his writings. His views of immortality, or at any rate of the arguments by which it may be established, pass through several phases. In the Phaedo, the whole argument is that the theory of ideas and the doctrine of the immortality or divinity of the soul stand or fall together. This position is rather startlingly different from the agnosticism of the Apology, in which Socrates says that no one knows what happens after death, but there is a considerable hope that the good man may find himself in more congenial company than he has met with on earth. It may be that if the speech was actually delivered by Socrates, it does not contain those deeper convictions which he reserved for his friends. There is a hint at the beginning of the Phaedo that Socrates has more convincing arguments than those which he used when addressing his judges, and it is likely enough that he would not make confession of his mystical faith to a mixed and mainly hostile audience. In the Meno, an early dialogue, immortality is treated as a beautiful tale of priests and poets, but he also says that if the truth of real being, ta onta, is in the soul, it must be immortal. In the Phaedo, the first argument calls in the doctrine of reminiscence, which is used to establish pre-existence. It is inferred that the soul remains unchanged through successive incarnations, but this is only an indication of survival for a time, not a proof of immortality. Then, finding his hearers not satisfied, the Platonic Socrates argues that the idea of soul is the idea of an entity unchangeable and imperishable. Or assuming the doctrine of ideas, we may argue that since the ideas are simple and indiscernible, the soul which knows them must be so too. Lastly, after disposing of the notion that the soul is a harmony of the body, he argues that the soul is the idea of life, and is therefore alien to death. This seems to be a fallacy. Footnote: it is the familiar fallacy of the old ontological proof. The proper inference would only be that the soul, as far as it exists, is alive and not dead. The argument ends with the well-known myths about the condition of souls hereafter, of which Socrates feels sure that something like it must be true. In the Republic and Phaedrus, he argues no longer that the soul is immortal because it partakes in the idea of life, but that it has life, indestructible life, in its own right. It is not difficult, he says, in the Republic, to prove immortality, because soul is substance, and substance is indestructible. Nothing can be destroyed except by that which corrupts its own nature, and soul, which cannot be destroyed even by its own evil, injustice, or ignorance, a murderer is very much alive and wide awake, can still less be destroyed by any physical agency. This argument, he adds, applies to the soul as it really is, not to the soul contaminated by its association with flesh. This latter is like the sea god Glaucus, who is so encrusted with limpets and seaweed that he is hardly recognizable. In the Phaedrus, he argues that the cause of life is a self-moving principle, which cannot perish. Every self-moving principle is soul. By movement he means any form of activity. Soul is the self-determining principle in nature, and that which is self-determined can be affected by external things only indirectly, through its own will. If it is in a fallen state here, that must be because it has chosen to make for itself an unworthy environment, suited to its own disposition. God is not in fault. The fault is in the chooser. It is impossible to believe that the union of the immortal soul with the corruptible body, which only takes place because the soul has lost its wings, is immortal. If Plato had stopped here, his position would have been not unlike that of some modern philosophers, who hold that the world of reality is constituted by a plurality of independent spirits, each existing in its own right, very much as he at one time thought of the ideas as distinct and independent spiritual entities. In fact, the ideas and the souls would then threaten to coalesce. But this kind of pluralism could never satisfy Plato or any other Greek thinker. The ideas are not the souls of individuals, but half-hypostasized divine attributes, in which individual souls participate, a word which signifies a spiritual and non-quantitative relation. Moreover, the ideas, as Plato came to see, are not independent of each other. They are brought together by their common condition of dependence upon the idea of the good. Just so, individual souls derive their being from their creator, God. Thus, a new argument for immortality appears in the Timaeus. The higher part of souls, at any rate, is the direct work of the divine intelligence which created them. God cannot wish to destroy his own work, and nothing else can destroy it. Individual souls, then, are not immortal in their own right. They are immortal because they are made by God in his own image, and it is only the higher part of the soul of which this can be said. We are therefore left in some doubt how much of what we consider our souls is really immortal. There is no abstract ego about which the blunt question, to be or not to be, can be asked. Aristotle's doctrine of immortality depends on his characteristic view of activity, energeia. Instead of the conception of substance as the unchanging substratum of change, he holds that perfect activity transcends change and motion. Activity is the actual functioning of a substance, the nature of which is only so revealed. So far from activity being a kind of movement, kinesis, he says that movement is imperfect activity. Activity does not necessarily imply motion or change. In the frictionless activity of God, which constitutes his happiness, there is neither. Change is sweet to us because of a certain defect. The happiness of God is derived from an activity which transcends movement. For time is the creature of movement. It is the number of movement. Kineseos arithmos. The perfecting of the time consciousness carries us into eternity, where there is no time and no movement. God is an eternal perfect being, so that life and continuous and eternal duration belong to God, for God is all this. As regards the immortality of the individual, Aristotle has always been considered to give very dubious support to the hopes of mankind. In fact, his treatment of the subject in the De Anima makes it fairly clear that it is only what we should call the impersonal nous which is immortal. The eschatology of the Stoics is vague and uncertain. In a sense, the soul must be immortal, because nothing ever really perishes. Forms change, but the substance persists. The destiny of the soul, as of everything else, is to be reabsorbed into the primal essence, which the Stoics, following Heraclitus, identified with, or symbolized by, fire. But they were not agreed whether this absorption takes place immediately after death, nor whether the individual continues to keep his individuality till the great conflagration, nor whether he falls by degrees into the divine essence through a course of gradual purification. Marcus Aurelius is quite agnostic on the subject. Thou hast embarked, thou hast made thy voyage, thou hast come to port, leave the ship. If there is another life, there are gods there, as here. If thou passest to a state without sensation, thou wilt be delivered from the bonds of pleasure and pain. Further, Cleanthes held that the souls of all men live on till the conflagration. Chrysippus, that only the souls of the wise live after death. In a new cycle, they taught, souls return to earth, and the successive lives of Socrates the first and Socrates the second will resemble each other, though, in opposition to Plato, there is no reminiscence of former lives. But in some of the later Stoics, footnote, Panetius, an eclectic and independent thinker, stands apart as a declared disbeliever in individual immortality. When the prejudice against Platonism had disappeared, a real belief in personal immortality was not discouraged. Seneca believes in a heaven very like that of the Christian religion. He is able to say of death, "That day which you dread as your last is your birthday into eternity." Seneca is known to have been influenced by Pythagorean doctrine. Footnote, through his teacher Sotion, who induced him to be a vegetarian. But he is on Stoical ground when he adduces common consent as an argument for immortality. The Epicureans, as is well known, denied a future life altogether, but the influence of this school was declining in the generations before Plotinus. Educated men, probably in most cases, believed vaguely in some sort of survival, and sometimes filled in their pictures of a future life with such a jumble of eschatologies as is found in the 6th Aeneid of Virgil, which doubtless affected Roman beliefs as much as Paradise Lost has affected those of Englishmen. The common people and religiously minded conservatives continue to pay respect to the manes of the dead, and believe that their spirits haunt the neighborhood of their tombs. Etruria had contributed a less pleasant kind of spiritualism, that which maintained the old festival of the maleficent Lemures in May. Footnote, Ovid thinks that the occurrence of this festival in May is the reason why marriages in that month are supposed to be unlucky. I found this precious superstition very rife in my fashionable West End parish, but those who held it had not read Ovid and did not observe the Lemuralia. Belief in survival was supported by numerous ghost stories of the familiar type, such as are ridiculed by Lucian in his Philopseudes. In this dialogue, all the chief philosophical schools, except the Epicureans, are represented as joining in the tales of apparitions. The younger Pliny believes in haunted houses. For the age of the Antonines, Galen is as good a witness as any. He believes firmly in providence, but sees difficulties in all the theories of a future life. The Platonists of this period, with Plutarch and Maximus at their head, were the great champions of immortality. Plutarch bases his belief, as so many do in our day, mainly on the justice of God and the rationality of the world order. He points out that even the most somber beliefs about the torments of the damned are more welcome to the majority of mankind than the prospect of annihilation. The Epicureans deprive mankind of their highest hopes, while seeking to rescue them from their fears. In 2 of his works, Plutarch recounts myths like those of the Phaedo and Republic, visions of judgment which, he would have us believe, are probably not very far from the truth. But the 2 pictures of the world of spirits are not alike. In the first, Thespesius, a bad man who had apparently been killed by an accident, revives on the 3rd day and tells his experiences. He has found an inferno and a purgatorio, and a 3rd form of punishment unknown to Dante, in which carnal souls are sent to inhabit the bodies of animals. The penalties are rather ingenious. The hypocrites are turned inside out. The miser is plunged into a lake of boiling gold. The soul of the cruel man is blood red. That of the envious is blue. In the other myth, Timarchus descends into the cave of Trophonius and sees a revelation of the spirit world. An unseen guide explains to him that it has 4 divisions. The highest sphere is that of the invisible one. Next comes the region of pure spirit, ruled over by the sun. The moon is queen of the 3rd kingdom, that of soul. Below, on the other side of Styx, is the world of matter. After death, the first death, the soul wanders between the realms of the moon and earth. The second death finally liberates the spirit from its association with this muddy vesture of decay. All souls have a spark of the divine nature in them, but in some it is clogged and swamped by the baser elements. Some souls, when released from the body, fly straight upwards. Others wander through the middle air. Others fall back again to earth. Even the daimons may incur this last fate. These and similar myths express in poetical and imaginative form the kind of theodicy which the religious mind of the Greek was at this time prepared to accept. They have an obvious resemblance to some Christian pictures of judgment, but it was not till theology came under the rigid discipline of the Roman Church that these visions of the invisible became authoritative maps of the undiscovered country and prophecies of future events.